The morning the season opened its books on Miss Cecily Wren, she had already been awake for 3 hours. She had not been awake reviewing her own situation, which was settled and unpleasant, and not improved by contemplation. She had been awake because the Earl of Ashmore's household account ledger did not reconcile, and had not reconciled since the second week of October, and the discrepancy was not large enough to be visible at a glance, but was precisely large enough, at £19 and 4 shillings, to matter enormously to someone who understood what the figure represented. Cecily understood. She had been trained in figures by a father who kept the books for a Yorkshire wool merchant, and she understood the difference between an error of arithmetic and an error of intent. An arithmetic error had the scattered, incidental quality of genuine carelessness. It appeared in the wrong columns, repeated itself accidentally, left traces of correction in the margins. What she had found had none of those qualities. It was neat. It was specific. It had been placed, and she had spent 3 days looking at the shape of the placement before she was ready to name what she saw. She was seated at the writing desk in the schoolroom at 5:30 in the morning when she found the document. The candle beside her had burned to a 1/4 inch. The house was silent except for the distant clink of the kitchen grate being opened 2 floors below, and the occasional creak of the building itself as November cold worked against the old timbers. Lord Ashmore's 2 children, Emmeline and Thomas, slept in the room beyond the connecting door, their breathing audible in the pause between gusts of November wind against the window glass. Cecily had checked them at 4, and again at 4:30, the way she always did on mornings when something unsettled her, as though the steadiness of their sleeping could steady her own mind. She was aware that this was not rational. She was aware of a great many things that did not improve her situation, and this one she had kept. She spread the document flat on the desk surface and held the candle close. The signature at the base of the promissory note read Edmund Harcourt, Earl of Ashmore, in a hand she had seen on 17 letters, 6 household orders, and the deed of instruction she had been given on the morning of her arrival. She had memorized that hand without meaning to, the way she memorized most things that passed through her attention, quietly and without announcement. The capital E of Edmund carried a slight inward curl at its lowest arm, a small, precise gesture that suggested a man who had been taught in one hand and had partly translated it to his own speed. The H of Harcourt broke at a deliberate angle, the upper and lower arms joined at a point that fell slightly left of center, consistent in every letter she had ever seen him produce. The signature on the promissory note had neither of those features. It was a very good forgery. Someone had studied the hand with care, had replicated the general character of the letter forms, had even reproduced the spacing that Lord Ashmore tended to leave between his title and his surname, wider than fashionable and deliberate in its width. The E began differently, its lowest arm swinging outward rather than curling in, the kind of variation that a hasty reader would not catch and a careful one would. And the H broke in a direction that was nearly correct, but was the mirror of what it ought to be, as though the forger had looked at the original and reproduced it left-handed, capturing the impression without the underlying gesture. £19 and 4 shillings, drawn against the household account. Payable to a firm in Cheddle Street that Cecily did not recognize, dated 3 weeks prior, signed in the Earl of Ashmore's name by someone who was not the Earl of Ashmore. She sat very still in the candlelight and thought about what she knew. She was 22 years old and had been employed in this household for 4 months. She was not the children's first governess. She had gathered from Mrs. Plum, the housekeeper, their 4th in 2 years, which she had taken as information rather than warning, and which had proved accurate in its implications. The household was not an easy one. Lord Ashmore was cold, precise, and rarely present before the evening hour. And when he was present, he moved through his own rooms as though he was inspecting rather than inhabiting them. He had interviewed Cecily for the position with a thoroughness that had startled her, asking not merely about her languages and her music, but about her father's profession, her familiarity with household accounts, whether she had ever been required to manage a budget of any kind. She had told him the truth. He had said nothing to indicate that truth was useful to him. She had concluded, on the walk home from the interview, that it had not been. She had been wrong about that. She had found him, in the 4 months since, to be a man who was very nearly impossible to read. Not cold in the theatrical sense, not cruel in the careless sense, but compressed, as though some considerable part of what he was had been reduced through long pressure into a form that occupied less space than it ought. He was capable of kindness toward the children. She had seen it in small gestures that he seemed unaware of performing. A hand on Emmeline's shoulder as he passed, a book placed at Thomas's side of the table without comment. He was capable of precision that approached beauty, in the way he organized a legal argument or read a surveyor's report. He did not look at people the way most people looked at people, and he very rarely looked at her. And when he did, she had developed the particular habit of looking elsewhere, because looking back at him directly felt like a thing she could not quite afford. The children she had found, by the end of the first week, to be something quite different. Emmeline was 9 and had her father's precision and her dead mother's dark eyes, and she grieved without speaking about it, and expressed the grief by correcting the household's arithmetic whenever given the opportunity, and by keeping count of things that had no particular need to be counted. Thomas was 6, and he had learned to be very quiet in the way that small children learn to be quiet when the adults around them have become unpredictable, and the first time Cecily had read aloud to him in the schoolroom, he had taken hold of a fold of her skirt with both hands and held on for the duration of 4 chapters without comment, as though she might leave before the book was finished. She had not left. She looked at the forged signature for a long moment. Then she folded the document, placed it inside the back cover of the household accounts ledger, and sat quietly with her hands in her lap, while the candle burned the last of its 1/4 inch down to nothing, and the cold of the room settled against her shoulders. If she were wrong, she would lose this position. She would lose the £14 per year that was the difference between her current situation and one she did not care to contemplate. She would lose Emmeline's careful arithmetic, and Thomas's grip on her skirt, and the particular quality of early morning in this house before anyone was awake, which was the only time the house felt like something she might be permitted to belong to. If she were right and said nothing, she would lose something else. She was less certain what to name it. She had been her father's daughter long enough to know that a forged signature on a promissory note was not an end. It was a beginning. It meant that someone in this house had decided that the household accounts were an instrument available for use, and that the Earl's name could be borrowed for purposes he had not authorized, and that this had been done once, and would therefore be done again until it was stopped. She carried the ledger to her room, placed it under her pillow, and did not sleep. If you have ever waited for morning to arrive so that you could do a difficult and necessary thing, you will understand the quality of those hours. Leave a thought in the comments, if Cecily's steadiness speaks to you. The story is only beginning. The children breakfasted at 7. Cecily sat with them at the schoolroom table, poured Thomas's milk, watched Emmeline eat her toast in the precise bites of a child who was thinking about something other than toast, and said nothing about what she had found. After breakfast, there were French verbs and geography, and a long dispute about the correct pronunciation of the word Mozambique, which Cecily ruled in Emmeline's favor on the evidence of the atlas, producing the atlas and opening it to the relevant page and reading aloud the note in the margin in a tone that permitted no further argument. Emmeline accepted this verdict with the particular grace of a child who has been right and has also now been confirmed to be right. Thomas fell asleep over his primer at 10:30, which was his habit on gray mornings, his head tilting first to one side and then drifting to his arms, and Cecily carried him to the daybed by the window and covered him with the wool blanket and stood for a moment watching him sleep with his mouth slightly open and his hands curled the way a much younger child's hands curled. She thought of someone using this house to steal from this man, and this man not knowing it. She thought of being a governess, and of the person doing it almost certainly knowing that a governess would not be believed. She thought these things, and then she tucked the blanket more firmly around Thomas's shoulders and picked up the household ledger and went out. She was carrying it under her arm and her shawl over her shoulders, moving along the corridor toward the back stairs, when she met the Earl of Ashmore coming up from the ground floor. He took the stairs at his customary pace, which was even and unhurried, and he stopped at the landing with his usual completeness, not slowing but halting entirely, and his eyes went immediately to the ledger under her arm. Something in his face closed over so quickly she might have imagined it. "Miss Wren," he said. His voice was level, the way a ruled line was level. "My lord," she said. She did not step back, because she had learned in the first week that stepping back in this house meant standing still for quite a long time afterward, and she could not afford that today. He looked at the ledger. "That is the household accounts." "It is." "It is not generally kept in the schoolroom." "No," she said. "I took it there last night. I have been reviewing it." A pause. Outside the corridor window, the November light was flat and gray and very clear, the kind of light that showed things without flattery. "Have you?" he said. "I have found something that I think you should see," she said. "I am aware that it is not my place to say so. I am aware that what I am about to tell you may result in my dismissal." She held his eyes, which required an effort she did not acknowledge. "I have decided to tell you regardless." He was looking at her very carefully. She had grown accustomed in 4 months to the quality of his attention, which was not the diffuse social attention of a man performing interest, but the focused and concentrated attention of a man who believed that accuracy mattered. He gave it to ledgers. He gave it to legal documents. He had once given it to a letter from his steward about a drainage ditch in a way that had struck her as almost tender. He was giving it now to her face, and she kept her face still under it, the way she had learned to keep her face still under most things. "Come to the study," he said. She followed him. The house steward, Mr. Vance, was a man of 52 who had been in the Earl of Ashmore's service for 11 years and who had the particular confidence of a man whose position had never been questioned. He managed the household's accounts under Lord Ashmore's oversight, which in practice meant that he submitted reports, and Lord Ashmore reviewed them with the regularity of a man who trusted his household to run correctly and verified it at intervals rather than continuously. It was a reasonable arrangement. It was also the arrangement that had made what followed possible. Cecily had not said any of this in the study. She had laid the ledger on the Earl's desk, opened it to the back cover, placed the document on the blotter, and pointed at the signature without speaking. Lord Ashmore had looked at it for a long time. "The capital E," she said at last, because the silence had stretched past the point she could sustain it. "And the H." He reached into his own coat pocket without looking away from the document and produced a folded letter. He opened it. His own signature was at the base of the page, the inward curl and the characteristic break both present and unmistakable. He placed it beside the promissory note and looked at both. The silence in the study was different from the silence in the corridor. It had weight to it, the weight of a man confronting something he had suspected and had not permitted himself to name. "How long have you known?" he said. "Since 5:30 this morning," she said. "I found the discrepancy in the account 3 days ago. I could not determine its source until last night." 3 days, he said very quietly, in the tone of a man not speaking to her. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything," she said. "I am certain." He looked up from the documents then. He was 37, and she had not let herself look at him carefully before, because looking at things carefully was a habit she had, and it was not safe to apply it to him. But she looked at him now because the moment seemed to require it. His jaw was set, his eyes were gray and steady, and there was something in them that was not anger, exactly, but was adjacent to it, the particular quality of a man who has been deceived by someone he placed in a position of trust. "Miss Wren," he said. "My lord. Has anyone else seen this?" "No," she said. He nodded once, the small, precise nod she had seen him give to documents that confirmed what he had already suspected. "Thank you," he said. The words were plain and direct, and entirely without the social coding people usually put on gratitude, and she found, to her own annoyance, that this made them considerably harder to receive than the usual kind. She left the study. She walked back to the schoolroom. Thomas was still asleep. Emmeline had finished the atlas exercise and was now conducting an audit of the inkwells, which was not a task Cecily had assigned, but which was entirely consistent with Emmeline's character, and which Cecily registered without comment, because some tasks needed no assigned origin to have their purpose. To the season's assembled wisdom, she was simply the governess. She was the fourth governess, the one who had lasted 4 months when the others had not, the one who ate her meals in the schoolroom and walked the children in the park on dry days, and was occasionally glimpsed in the corridor carrying a ledger. Lady Constance Hartley, who was Lord Ashmore's aunt, and had appointed herself the household social guardian in the absence of a countess, had said to her at their one meeting in October, with the settled gentleness of a woman who considers herself a realist, "You are very sensible, Miss Wren, for a woman in your position." She had meant it as a kindness. She had meant that Cecily knew what she was and was behaving accordingly. And this is all we require. Cecily had thanked her and returned to the schoolroom. She thought about this now, the phrase "in your position" and what it contained. She thought about all the positions that phrase could mean. She thought about the study and the 2 signatures on the blotter, and the Earl's gray eyes finding her face with that quality of accurate attention. And she thought about the fact that she had been right to bring the document forward, and also that being right would not necessarily protect her, and also that she had known both these things before she walked to the study and had walked there regardless. There was a word for that, she supposed. She was not certain she had earned the right to use it for herself. The house steward was removed from his position on Wednesday. Cecily learned this from Mrs. Plum, who told her in the kitchen passage with the particular hushed certainty of someone delivering information they have already metabolized thoroughly. She learned that a solicitor had been brought in. She learned that papers had been examined and that Mr. Vance had not contested the findings, and that he had departed the house early on Wednesday morning with 2 cases and a composure that Mrs. Plum found more troubling than distress would have been. She did not learn any of these things from Lord Ashmore. She did not see Lord Ashmore for 3 days after the study. On the 4th day, he came to the schoolroom door at 3:30 in the afternoon. He knocked. This was unusual. He did not generally knock. Emmeline looked up from her geography exercise with the expression of a child who has filed this observation for later analysis. Thomas looked up from his drawing and then looked back at it, because Thomas's method of addressing unusual situations was to pretend they were not occurring until he had processed them in private. "Miss Wren," Lord Ashmore said from the doorway, "when the children have finished, I would appreciate a word." She kept her expression still. "Of course, my lord." He left. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, measured and even. Emmeline waited precisely until the footsteps had faded, and then said, without looking up from her geography, "He never comes to the schoolroom at 3:30. "No," Cecily said. "He does not." "He is not angry," Emmeline said. This was an observation, not a question. Emmeline was 9 and had spent 2 years reading the difference between her father's silence of anger and his other silences, and she was very rarely wrong about either. "I do not believe so," Cecily said. "Then something happened that he needs to address," Emmeline said, with the finality of a verdict delivered, and returned to her geography. Cecily sat with Thomas until he finished the drawing, which was of a horse with 7 legs and a rider in a tall hat, who appeared very pleased with the situation. Thomas presented it to her at the end with the gravity of a man offering a legal document of some importance. She thanked him with equivalent gravity and placed it on the schoolroom shelf where she kept the accumulation of his weekly offerings, which had begun as a sparse collection in August and now occupied the entire upper shelf and were beginning to populate the middle one in a slow and earnest expansion. She went down to the study at 4 o'clock. Lord Ashmore was standing at the window when she entered. He turned when she came in, and he said, "Sit down," and then appeared to reconsider the instruction and amended it. "Please." She sat. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. He remained standing, not with the stillness she was accustomed to in him, but with a quality of restlessness that she recognized only because it was so unlike his ordinary composure. He had his hands clasped behind him, and then at his side, and then he put one on the window frame and looked at it as though he had not decided to. "The solicitor informs me," he said, "that the promissory note was one of 7. Vance had been doing this for 14 months. Cecily said nothing. "Had you not found it," he said, "the matter would have come to a head this spring, when the accounts were reviewed in advance of the entail assessment. At that point, my solicitor tells me, the amount and the pattern would have been sufficient to raise a serious question of the Earl's own involvement, which was, as best they can determine, the intent. She absorbed this. He meant to implicate you. He had cause to wish me ill," Lord Ashmore said, not as an excuse, but as a fact placed at its correct valuation, neither enlarged nor diminished. "I discharged his son from the estate 6 years ago for falsifying the harvest accounts. The son was transported. Vance held the position and waited." He paused. "He was patient," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that was almost like recognition. The way one might acknowledge a craftsman's skill when the craft had been applied to a terrible purpose. "I am glad I found it in time, then," she said. "You are," he said, "considerably more than glad, Miss Wren. You have prevented what would have been a material destruction of this estate and everything connected to it. The children's inheritance, the staff's livelihood, my own reputation, which is the thing that permits the estate to function in the social machinery it must function in." He paused. "I do not say this to dramatize the situation. I say it because it is accurate." The words were plain and exact, and she felt them the way she felt plain words, more thoroughly than the ornamented kind. "I was reviewing the accounts in any case," she said. "It was not a heroic undertaking. I asked you, when I employed you, whether you were familiar with household accounts." He had turned from the window fully now, and was looking at her with that careful attention again. I did not tell you why I asked. No, she said. You did not. I had reason to believe something was wrong, he said. I could not prove it. I asked every candidate I interviewed. You were the first who said yes, and the first who told me you had managed figures professionally rather than as a domestic accomplishment. She looked at him. I did not hire you as a spy, he said. I hired you because you could teach my children and because you told me the truth when a more strategic applicant would have softened it, and because you looked at Emmeline and Thomas in the interview and attended to them rather than to me. I want to be clear about all of that. You are being very clear, she said carefully. And yet, he said, and stopped. The study was quiet around them. The fire had burned to a low, steady heat, and the afternoon light was going early as it did in November, the room catching the last of it at the window, while everything else deepened into warmth. She was aware, in the particular way she had trained herself not to be aware of this man, of how much the room had contracted since she sat down. He had moved from the window without her tracking the moment, and he was on the other side of his own desk, which was not close but was closer than he had been. And yet, she said, I am aware, he said, that what I am about to say falls outside the bounds of what is appropriate for me to say to a woman in your employ. He looked at her with the directness she was not accustomed to from him, the directness of a man who has argued himself into something and is going to see it through. I am aware of what the season would say about it. I am saying it regardless. Her hands were very still in her lap. Her heart was not, and she was grateful that hearts were not visible to persons standing at a study desk. You do not need to say anything, she said. If it would be easier. It would not be easier, he said. Nothing about this has been easy. A pause. I have been watching you with my children for 4 months. I have been watching you manage this household's necessities with a competence that most women of superior station do not bother to acquire. I have been watching you tell the truth in situations where the truth was costly, and I have been watching you do it without any expectation of reward or recognition, as though you genuinely believe that honest action is its own sufficient justification. His voice had not changed in register. It was still level. Something lived underneath the levelness now, something that had the quality of a door opened. I do not want you to leave this house. The fire settled. Outside, the first of the evening wind moved down the street. I have not said I intended to leave, she said. You have not, he agreed. I am saying that I do not want you to, and that my reasons are not limited to my children, though my children are among them. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not emptiness, but the opposite. I am not skilled at this, he said. I have not tried to be these past years. I want you to know that the difficulty is mine, and not a commentary on your worth. She looked at him for a long moment, the study and the fire and the November evening settling around them. Why have you not tried to be? She said. Not as a challenge. As a genuine question, the kind she asked herself in the dark at 5:30, when something did not reconcile. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. And then he crossed to the writing table and opened the center drawer and took out a miniature in a worn brass frame, and he held it briefly before he placed it on the desk surface so that she could see it. It was a young woman, painted in the style of 15 years prior, with dark hair, and an expression that was neither quite solemn nor quite at ease. Something between those two things that suggested a person who had been asked to sit still for longer than she found natural. My wife, he said, was 24 when she died. The second winter of our marriage. She was not ill. She fell on the stairs. He placed his hand briefly on the edge of the miniature frame, not picking it up, The stair carpet had needed replacing for some time. I had been aware of it. I had not addressed it. The simplicity of it was devastating. Cecily looked at the miniature, and then at his face. "You have been blaming yourself," she said. "I have been being accurate," he said. "The stair carpet was a fixable thing. I did not fix it. The connection is not complicated." His jaw was very set. "What is complicated is the fact that I have 2 children who need a father who is present, and I have spent 2 years being present in the sense of inhabiting the same building and absent in every other sense, and I am aware that this is not sufficient, and I am attempting to do better, and I am finding it difficult to begin." She sat with this. She sat with the miniature on the desk and the fire behind her, and the man across from her who had just handed her the most accurate and most painful thing he possessed, without ornamentation. "Thomas holds on to my skirt," she said quietly, after a moment. "When I read to him. He does it because he learned very early that people leave. And he is checking that I have not." Lord Ashmore's face did something she had not seen it do in 4 months. It was brief, and it was contained immediately. But it was there, and she had been accurate enough in her 4 months of watching him to recognize what it was. "I know," he said. "He does not hold on to yours?" she said, not as an accusation. As information offered carefully, the way she offered things that she knew would land with weight. "No," he said. A pause. "Not yet." She stood up from the chair. She did it slowly, the way one moved in a room where the air had a quality to it that was different from ordinary air. She took 1 step toward the desk and stopped. "The stair carpet was a fixable thing," she said. "The rest of it is also a fixable thing. They are not the same kind. They are fixable, nonetheless." He looked at her across the desk. There was a distance between them and the quality of the November afternoon, and the particular silence of a house whose children were 2 floors above them. She was aware of her own breathing in a way she was not generally aware of it, and aware of his eyes on her face, and aware that the 4 months of not looking at him directly had not, as it turned out, made her any less capable of being looked at by him. "Miss Wren," he said, and then did not continue, and she understood that he had reached the edge of what he knew how to say. "Cecily," she said, because it seemed to be required, because some moments had a logic to them that was stronger than what was appropriate. He was quiet, and then he said it. "Cecily." Her name in his voice, level and deliberate and careful, and carrying underneath the levelness something that his care in pronouncing it only made heavier. She felt it in her sternum, in the hollow of her throat, in the palms of her hands. She had been waiting. She understood now for him to say it, in the way one waits without acknowledging that one is waiting. And the waiting had lasted exactly 4 months and 3 days. "I will not pretend," she said, "that I have not been attempting for 4 months not to notice you." Something crossed his face. It was not quite amusement and not quite relief, and it lived in the very narrow space between those 2 things, a space she had not known his face contained until this moment. "I had gathered," he said, "that you were quite determined about it." "I was," she said. "I am apparently less determined than I thought." He came around the desk. He did it with the same economy he brought to everything, no excess of motion, and he stopped at a distance that was proper, and was also close enough that she was aware of the specific warmth of another person in a cold room, and the specific quality of his breath, and the fact that his hands, at his sides, had finally stilled. "I would like to ask you a question," he said. "You may ask me any question," she said. "Not as your employer," he said. I am setting that aside entirely. I understand. He looked at her for a moment. What was in his face was not the careful, contained scrutiny she had grown accustomed to, but something else. Something that had the quality of exposure, of a man who had not looked at something directly for a long time and was looking at it now and was not going to look away again. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not as a governess." They both understood that. She met his eyes. She thought of Thomas's hands on her skirt, and Emmeline's careful arithmetic and the schoolroom shelf with its accumulation of 7-legged horses. She thought of 5:30 in the morning, and the candle at a 1/4 inch, and the moment she had decided she was going to carry the ledger down to the study regardless of what it cost her. "Yes," she said. "I will stay." He reached out and took her hand, the way a man reached for something he had been afraid to reach for, and had decided, finally, that the afraid part did not get a vote. His hand was warm and deliberate around hers, and she looked at it for a moment, the two hands together in the firelight. And then she looked at him. Outside, the November evening had arrived entirely, and the gas lamps were being lit in the street below, their glow catching the frost that was beginning to settle on the window glass. Somewhere 2 floors above them, Emmeline was finishing her geography exercise with characteristic precision, and Thomas was drawing another horse, and the household was a household still, ticking along in its November rhythms, changed and entirely the same. 3 weeks later, Lady Constance Hartley arrived at the house in Cavendish Square for an afternoon call. She was shown to the drawing room, where she expected to find the Earl of Ashmore alone and available for counsel. She found him instead standing at the fireplace in conversation with Miss Cecily Wren, who was not in a governess's plain dress, but in a morning dress of soft gray wool that Constance did not recognize and could not quite categorize, and who looked up when Constance entered with an expression that was entirely composed and entirely without apology. "Constance," Lord Ashmore said, with the specific neutrality of a man delivering information at its intended weight, "I am glad you have called. I had intended to write to you this week." "Indeed," Lady Constance said, and her eyes moved from his face to Cecily's, and back again with the rapid calculation of a woman arriving at a total she had not expected. "Miss Wren and I are engaged," he said, simply, without ceremony or embellishment. "The announcement will appear in the Gazette on Thursday." Lady Constance said, "Edmund," in the tone of a woman who had not yet found the correct response. "She identified the forgery that would have destroyed this estate," he said. "She has kept my children in better shape than I have managed myself, and she has told me the truth at cost to herself on more than one occasion." He paused. "I consider those qualifications substantially more relevant than whatever the Season would say about her position. The Season is not the authority I find most persuasive." Constance looked at Cecily. Cecily met her eyes. She did not speak, because the moment did not require her to speak. She had spent 4 months in this house being very sensible for a woman in her position, and she was not being sensible now, and she had stopped requiring the difference between the two things to be justified. After a long moment, Constance said stiffly, "She is quite plain, Edmund." "She is," he said, entirely without inflection. And then, more quietly, "She is also the most honest person I have met in 11 years of keeping this house. I am choosing accordingly." It was 12 words. It was precisely as many words as the situation required. Constance sat down, which was a form of concession. She took the tea that was brought and held it with the particular straightness of a woman engaged in reassessment, and she looked at Cecily once more, and something in that look had shifted from the comfortable certainty of a verdict rendered to something more like study. "You are not at all what I expected," she said to Cecily. "No," Cecily said, "I rarely am." The engagement was confirmed before Christmas. The solicitor came on a Tuesday morning with the papers, and Lord Ashmore signed them at his desk with his own signature, the capital E with its inward curl, and the H that broke at the angle she had memorized without meaning to, on a night in early November, by the light of a quarter-inch of candle, in a schoolroom where 2 children were sleeping. She watched him sign and thought about what it meant to be accurate about something, and what it meant to be accurate about a person, and about the specific quality of attention he had given her from almost the first week, which she had read as scrutiny, and which had been, she understood now, something else entirely. Emmeline had received the news of the engagement with characteristic precision, asking 2 clarifying questions and then nodding once in the manner of a child who has confirmed a hypothesis. Thomas had said nothing for 3 days, and then had presented Cecily with a drawing of 2 horses standing side by side, both of them anatomically implausible and very pleased with their situation, with a rider on the larger one wearing a hat. She kept it on the shelf beside all the others. On the first morning of December, with frost on the window glass and the fire built up against the early cold, she sat in the morning room with the household accounts ledger open on her lap, the new figures in order, the columns reconciled to the penny. Lord Ashmore came in at 8:30, earlier than he generally came to that room, and stood in the doorway for a moment, with that quality of looking at something directly that she had become accustomed to receiving from him. "The accounts are in order," she said. "I have no doubt of it," he said. She put the ledger aside. He came and sat in the chair across from her, and outside the December frost held the garden in a white quiet, and inside the fire held everything warm. Thomas appeared in the doorway at 8:45, barefoot and trailing the wool blanket from his bed, and looked at both of them with the expression of a child who has found something he was afraid might have been misplaced. Lord Ashmore reached out his hand without speaking. Thomas crossed the room and took hold of it, both of his small hands around his father's one, and leaned against the chair arm in the way that small children lean when they have decided they are staying. The frost was still on the glass. The fire was steady. The miniature in the worn brass frame sat on the study desk 2 rooms away, as it always sat, facing the window that looked toward the garden. Cecily sat with the morning around her, the ledger closed on the side table, and the household quiet, and the man across from her reading his correspondence with his son, leaning against his arm, and thought that this was what it felt like when a thing that had been missing was finally in its correct place, plain and solid, and requiring no further proof. Thank you for staying with Cecily to the end. If her courage moved you, leave a thought in the comments.